Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's been a very exciting time the last week, setting up notes and preparing for the presentation, and I hope that you'll find it very relevant. And to start off, I want to recap just a couple things we started the last sessions with, and that's about the nature of our endeavor. And first and foremost, I'm interested in the present. I'm interested in the lives we live. And as a historian, when I turn to the past, I do so keeping in mind that it's the story of how we came to live the way we do, and it helps us understand the world around us. So the series is intended to look at the automobile around us and the world around us in a broad sense, and delve into the past and see how we can use that to make sense of the present. And so there's a couple central tenets of history that guide that. And one tenet is that history does not repeat itself. Every single moment is unique. However, the human spirit maintains itself, and it manifests itself in different ways across time. And so that's the reason the past becomes very relevant. It becomes a window, if you will, into who we are as human beings. The process of history is not a process of just listing a whole bunch of facts and dates. The question is, what do they mean? What do they cause? What were the consequences? How did they develop? And how do they shape the world we live in? So it's an interpretive process. Another central concept I want to remind you of is the concept of agency. And this is the concept that nothing just happens by accident. You can talk about forces of history, or you can talk about intellectual systems of thought, ideologies, but ultimately there's a person, a single person who makes a decision, or groups of people, but history itself flows out of the decisions that humans make. And on one plane, this really simplifies the study of history because it makes it clear what we should be looking for as we're digging in the past. At the same time, it helps us illuminate the present, because this is something that can empower you as you move into your present. Remember that the future is simply the consequences of the choices that you're making now. And that's, for me, one of the beautiful things about studying history. Another important guideline for us is that we want to maintain multi-causality. It's so easy for us to want to look for a single answer, or look for a single source of a problem or a solution, that one person did it and then it happened. But in fact, human life is so incredibly complex that each one of us, for example, has a lot of goals in our lives, and sometimes they conflict with each other. And if you look at where history came from and where the lives we live, where its origins are, it comes from many, many different sources and many, many different individuals across time. And so we want to make sure we have a complex enough look at the past and look at the present that we can make a more complete picture. And finally, we need to be a little bit humble, because the scope of this inquiry is so phenomenally immense. I wouldn't be qualified to do it, but there could easily be 1,000 sessions just like this, because it's international trade, it's biographies of individuals, it's engineering changes, it's lifestyle, the design of cities, it's marriage and family practices. The scope of the endeavor of understanding how the world is shaped by the automobile is just a vast enterprise, and it's endless because it changes every single day. And so that said, I want to turn our attention to a quick kind of a real quick synopsis of what we did last time. And last time, when we were here, we were looking at the antecedents of the automobile, and we were looking at how a series of things that had been put in place in the 16th and 17th centuries and 18th centuries, with urban design and roadways and entrepreneurial attitudes, environmental issues, all contribute to an environment in which the automobile would drop into and fit into with a really nice niche. And so the automobile was the result of a whole set of events that were happening in the world. And we only touched upon, as you see, about 8 of them, but there were many more than that, because it's a multi-causal explanation. And so now we're going to take that step forward that we took last time and move it forward a step. We're going to talk about the automobile as it goes global. We're going to talk about how it particularly impacted established firms, manufacturing process, entrepreneurs, and then kinds of technical knowledge. And so the globalization and the giants in them, our hills, have a couple interesting shapes. The first shape is this, and I hate to start you with a really big, boring chart, but as soon as you know what this means, you'll probably not think it's quite as boring as it is. This is a list of the largest economic entities in the world. So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, the United States is the largest economic entity. Its revenues in dollars, it was roughly $3,251,000,000,000. Second largest entity was China. Then comes Germany, Japan, France. Italy rolls in at 876 billion. But it gets interesting for me, and for the point I want to make today, is if you look at number 10 is Walmart, which rolls in at 482 billion, which is bigger than Spain, Austria, and the Netherlands. Then comes State Grid, which is the national energy corporation for China. But the things I want to point out in particular on this chart are number 22, which is Volkswagen, number 23, which is Toyota, number 27 that's a petroleum, which is very affiliated. But the next one is number 40, Daimler, and then down at number 45, I'll slow down a little bit for you. Coming in at 152 billion is General Motors at 45 and Ford Motors at 46. And you can follow down here, number 64, lower in the column is Honda Motors. And then up towards the right, number 75, SAIC, that's the Chinese National Automobile Corporation. And then number 80 comes in, which is BMW, and number 82, which is Nissan. And so obviously these are automobile manufacturers. These 10 companies represent a phenomenal amount of wealth and power in the global environment. And if you add to that the petroleum companies and the distribution companies that are on this list, the global location of wealth in the planet we live in is very much determined by the automobile. And another thing I'd like to point out about this list in front of you, and I really wish I could take questions right now because this is such an interesting list. But one of the really interesting things for me is I've been tracking this list. I teach international relations, and international trade is one of the topics I teach. And I've been tracking this list for about 25 years. And about 20 years ago, this list had 30 corporations on it, top 100, 30 corporations in 70 countries. This year, it has only 30 countries and 70 corporations. So the overwhelming number, there's roughly 180 countries in the world. The overwhelming number of countries in the world are dwarfed by the size of corporations in the global economy. And so this is a very interesting outcome. And I want to give you a quick term here to help us make sense out of what's going on here. And the term, of course, is a term you've all heard of, which is called globalization. And globalization has all kinds of terms, negatives and positives associated with it. But the concept is really simple. The concept of globalization is just like driving to the grocery store. You're going out and shopping something, except someone's able to deliver it from far away. And so the reason this makes sense is because you have increasing technology like transport, and then you have communications technology. And so a really useful definition for globalization is simply this: the increasing integration of economics, politics, communications, and social relations. Things are getting closer together. That's what it is. And this has actually had a phenomenal benefit for your lives that people probably don't imagine. The opportunity to work globally or work within a global environment. Most economists use the number something like 16 to 18% of all the wealth in the United States is due to globalization, international trade. I want you to think about that number for a minute. That's $1 out of $6. So if you were to take globalization from our lives, look out the window. You see 6 cars, take them away. You see 6 schools, take one away. You see 6 houses, take one away. 1/6 of all wealth in the United States. And one illustration of this is just recently when we've had the embargo and the trade disputes with China on just a few commodities. The total productivity of the United States has dropped between 1% and 2%, depending on the metrics that are used. And so this is a profound impact on our life at cost. There's downsides too of this incredible mobility. National outsourcing and job relocation. And this has been a real important story of the automobile within our lifetimes. Jobs being relocated to places where labor costs are lower. Another, COVID-19 is a globalization issue because disease has such rapid mobility now in a globalized planet. You can't simply treat diseases as national problems anymore. And so globalization is this really interesting feature. And so an interesting question for us is, how did it happen? How did we become globalized? And the answer, of course, is very complex. But the reason I'm bringing this up today is because the story of the Ford Motor Company and the story of General Motors are two of the central stories in the globalization that you and I are experiencing. Now, globalization has been a process that's always been going on. The Romans experienced it with their fleets in the Mediterranean, and the British Navy experienced it. But at the time when the Ford Motor Company is starting to be formed, we were entering a special phase with new steamships and some kind of global systems of agreements about transport. And a simple tool I like to use to think about is the banana. By the time the Model T is available, you can get in your Model T and drive into just about any town, any city in the United States and buy bananas. And obviously there's no bananas grown in the continental US or in the States at that time, what were states. And you could roll into grocery stores in the cities in Sweden and buy bananas by 1914. And so the planetary economy was globalized to some degree, but Ford would change that dramatically. And so now just a real quick recap of some of the significant points in the formation of Ford and how it goes globalized. Ford Motor Company is founded in 2003, and the Model T comes out in 1908. And the key things about the Ford processes that would launch it as a global superpower were the things that made it an economic superpower, particularly the assembly line process and the reliance on specialized machine tools. So that means I'm going to make a very sophisticated tool that almost anybody can operate. I'm going to reach out, hit the button, and operate it. And so it begins with a static assembly line, and then when the Highland Park facility grows in 1910, it becomes in 1913, it becomes a moving assembly line. And then, of course, the River Rouge complex, a massive industrial complex, about 1 mile by 1.5 miles across in 1916. And this becomes the most magnificent and sophisticated production facility the planet has ever seen. There's never been anything like it. And it means you can make more cars faster, more efficiently, more safely, not necessarily for the worker, but more quality control than has ever been done before. And some numbers that would illustrate that: 1908, the runabout sells at $825. Across time, it drops to $575, $345. And so in 1927, when T production ends, the coupe is selling for $290. So it goes from $825 to $290, despite inflation. The real numbers are dropping. And that's an indicator of this industrial powerhouse and efficiency that's making goods for everybody. I gotta keep my coffee going. So how does Henry Ford turn this into a global phenomenon? And the answer is, the thing about the production techniques is, one, it has this phenomenal emphasis on the process of production, but then it has a phenomenal emphasis on who's getting the money off the process. And so Fordism is sometimes called a mass continuous flow integrated production. So the integration of the production means that there's going to be upstream production, which means integration, which means he's going to reach into the sources of the things that come into Ford and integrate them in the Ford company. For example, I'm buying rubber, right? And so a rubber company is producing that. Well, that means that rubber company is making profit off of the rubber that's going into my car. Why don't I buy the rubber trees, buy the plantation, and then all the profit is moving into the system? And so no other people are making process off of my invention and my hard work. And so this would create upstream integration of all the things coming in. And so this would include steel mills, and it would include things like iron mines, lumber mills in Michigan, coal mines in Kentucky, glass plants in Pennsylvania. And one of the more interesting manifestations of this would be the Fordlandia project in Brazil, which is so interesting. Let's go to Fordlandia. Here was Fordlandia. This was a 1927 project. And so you can see on here a map. Fordlandia was here deep in the Amazon. This is traveled by river. By the way, but his idea was to build a massive rubber production city. And so in 1930, this had 10,000 residents. It was like a Detroit suburban town dropped into the Amazon. Modern housing, swimming pools, tennis courts, golf courses, hospitality, hospitals, libraries, everything you'd want. Now, it didn't pan out. It didn't work. And there's a lot of reasons, because it's a very complex project put in the Amazon, but it really illustrates how Henry Ford was thinking about the inputs, both upstream and the integration downstream. And so this idea of integrating all of the sources of income for a given profit becomes a model then that becomes one of the key elements of the globalizations of our planetary economy. Ford would globalize quickly after that. Actually, let me back that up. Ford was a global company from the beginning, and this is something that few people appreciate. So I mentioned earlier that Ford was created in 1903, the Ford Motor Company. Ford of Canada is created in 1904. It's nearly simultaneously. No sooner is the paperwork cleared for the United States Ford than the Canada Ford is off and running. And the Canada Ford is a very interesting exercise, because what it's recognizing is that trade depends and globalization depends on economic and political structures. Because if you can have Ford Canada, that means that you can trade anywhere in the British Commonwealth without tariffs. If you produce it in the United States and you ship it to another country, you have to pay tariffs. But if it's produced in a member of the British Commonwealth, you can have tariff-free production. So close on the back of that comes Ford in New Zealand, the Colonial Motor Company in 1911, Ford in South Africa, Ford in Australia, Ford in India. And so right from the get-go, Ford is going global. And this includes assembly plants, Ford-owned assembly plants in Ireland, in France, in England, and Denmark by 1923, 1945, and Austria. And to show you the real global reach of Ford, there's a really interesting story about an agreement that was made in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, had turned communist by then. And you could not, under the socialist way of understanding economies, to have a capitalist there exploiting your people with extracting profits from your country was absolutely untenable. But they wanted to have cars. So they made a deal with Ford that they would buy $13 million worth of Ford products. In exchange for buying those, Ford would send consultants over to build a factory. And thereafter, using Ford patents, they would have the right to build Ford cars and trucks inside of that factory. And so that's the first major phase, the first true megacorporation, a massive corporation that would fundamentally shape the world, because it was dominated automobile production in its early period. In the years of 1914 to 16, it's estimated that 50% of all cars on the planet were Model Ts. And so this is the first truly large corporation, and Ford was the first true economic rock star, if you will, the Bill Gates of his period. At the same time, there's something happening in another corporation within United States, and that corporation would become eventually General Motors. And so Billy Durant, William C. Durant, was, in some ways, he was to carriages what Ford was to cars. That's to say, in the late 1800s, he was one of the co-owners of the Durant Dort Carriage Company, which was the single largest carriage manufacturer in the United States. And of course, the early cars were a marriage of carriage technologies with motors and bicycle technologies, in a very rough sense, those kind of things combined. So he had all the infrastructure that he needed to build cars aside from a motor. And so in 1904, David Dunbar Buick designed this valve and head engine, but he couldn't make cars. He couldn't make people interested in them. He couldn't sell them. And so he sold 6 cars in 1903. He sold 16 cars in 1904, and he went belly up. That's when Billy Durant moved in and agreeing to capitalize and buy Buick and begin the Buick Motor Company, and he rapidly increased it. There was capital available was $75,000 on his first day. And his first day, he bumped the capitalization from $75,000 to $300,000. And then he began issuing stock. And I have the picture of the guy hauling the refrigerator into his igloo, because this is a charismatic, dynamic, fascinating individual who had a tremendous acumen with markets. And so Henry Ford had this massive acumen with engineering and design and processes, and Durant had this amazing acumen with markets, because 1 year later, after he's floated Buick, he started with a capitalization of $75,000, and 1 year later, in 1905, he has $1.5 million in stock issued from Buick. And so he's taken off like wildfire. He does a slightly different economic approach. Holy cow, time is screaming along. He has a very different economic approach from Ford, because he builds a trust. And this is the birth of the modern holding corporation. What he decides is, and he's not going to buy, this is something he'd done in Durant Dort Carriage Company. He's not going to buy the forest. He's going to buy a lumber company and keep it independent, but own that company. So he'll have subsidiary companies that he owns. And this is actually really great if you're interested in flexible design, because if the part is becoming obsolete and you want to swap it out, you don't have to retool the factory. You just stop buying from that factory and rebid whoever can make it for the lowest. And so General Motors would take a different place in the market, and they would have a more flexible approach. They did not go international early. They started their first international export and marketing office in 1911. And I think it sold 14 cars in 1911. In 1914, they saw what Ford was doing, decided they were going to go international. But then this is at the same time the World War I is breaking out. And so between 1914 and 1918, they roughly sell something on the order of a peak of 6,000 cars a year was the most they ever sold. In the meantime, Durant had troubles. There was a depression in 1910 that threw him out of control of his holding company, which became General Motors. A new president was appointed, and it was under the new president of General Motors, his name was Sloan, that Sloan decided, let me skip forward a little bit, that Sloan decided that he was going to globalize. And so he introduced important, significant styling changes and the idea of model updates. He's the one who created the flexible mass production, and this is very different from Henry Ford because he wanted to produce many models. And he created something called the ladder of success. So you're going to own multiple marks. And his ladder of success was that when you get your first car, it's going to be a Chevy, and then when you're getting a family, you're going to move into a Pontiac and up. And then if you achieve success in your life and everything goes right, you end up with a Cadillac. So he then began the internationalization of General Motors. And because this was a General Motors model, not a Ford model, he decided to do it in the General Motors style. The way that Durant had pioneered was create holding companies. So they began by having some import-export offices, and they set them up in Denmark and began marketing to GM. But then they realized that what they wanted to do was produce their own cars in Europe. And so in 1925, they purchased Vauxhall in Britain. In 1928, they set up 9 different assembly plants. But then in 29, they purchased Opel, which was the single largest manufacturer in Germany. They purchased Holden Motors in Australia. So they bought companies around the world. They examined Citroën Austin, were on their list of companies to buy, but after they did the physical plant inspection, they decided not to. But the key message here is by 1930, these were the 2 mega corporations. There were not a lot of mega corporations. There had been rail barons in the 1880s, and there had been steel magnates. Carnegie was significant, but this was a whole new scale, and the scale was global. And so they're pioneering the mega corporation in its role. Now, automobile production slumps dramatically in the 1930s. This is something called the Kindleberger Spile from Charles Kindleberger, an economist. And this is kind of hard to read, but on the very left hand, you see January, and you see the number 2,998. That's world trade measured in millions. So that's roughly $3 billion in in world trade. Well, all around the world, when the Depression hit, countries put up protectionist barriers. And so global protectionist barriers and tariffs went up to about 60% planet-wide. And what you see as you spiral your finger around that and follow it, you can see the decline, the collapse of world trade. And so world trade collapsed all the way down to less than $1 billion of world trade after the 4 years of these tariffs. And it remained constant until roughly the Second World War. Now, at the end of the Second World War, however, and by the way, in this period, GM and Ford maintain their unique status, and they continue to do so, by the way, for decades, literally for decades, is these unique player position in the global economy. And at the Second World War, there was a series of events that would catapult them into even more power. And the first was, if you look on the left side of the screen, you can see the Tokyo Toyota factory. It's actually the Kamura Toyota factory of Toyota in 1945, and you can see what's left of it. Well, global automobile production was like that all over the planet. Nobody had factories. Nobody had infrastructure to transport raw materials to make cars with. And so the United States was in a wonderfully unique position to go out into the planet. And so GM and Ford embrace this, and GM is ascendant. GM is the really big engine of planetary trade at this time. And on the graph on the right, you can see a graph which shows you world trade in billions of dollars. And this is the phenomenon that's really been since the 1970s. In the 1970s, there's changes in communications, and then you have the advent of the internet in the middle 90s becomes important. So you have market information, and then you have new developments in container ships, but then you see the advent of China around 2002 as a major player. And so planetary trade is accelerating, exploding. We live in a world in my lifetime that is profoundly different from the world that I was born into, and each one of you do too. I just have a couple more graphs that I want to show you. And this one is a graph that shows automobile production. And I just want you to follow the top line. Over 1950, there were about 10 million cars made on the planet, and then it's about 89 million by 2014. And I want you to look at the next line down, which is China. So China did not make a single car in 1950. In 1960, it's making 22 million. 22,574, 22,000 cars. But by 2014, they're making 23 million. Now, it's interesting because Detroit has some growth. You know, we have 8 million around 1970, up and down back to 8 in 2005, up to 12 in 2014. It's very close to what we are now. I'm going to show you the more modern figures in a minute. But you see the ascendance and fall of Japan. But the real interesting thing to me is what's happening on the rest of that screen. And what's happening on the rest of that screen is that there's a phenomenal change in the number of countries that are producing cars. Back in 1950, there were only 16 countries in the world that produced cars. Now there's 48 countries. And if you look at this change here, this is the millions of cars, the 2000 versus this is last year's production. World production is at 91 million. It's roughly doubled. But look what's happened to China, from 2.1 million cars to 2.57 million. Look what's happened in the United States, gone from 12.1 to 10.8. Japan, 10.1 to 9.7. But as you work down, you know, look at India, 800,000 cars in year 2000, and now at 4.5 million cars. It looks at Mexico, 3.1 to 4. Big change in Brazil, 1.9 to 3. Thailand, from 400,000 cars to 2 million cars. And more importantly, as you go down the list, there's 48 countries now that are producing cars. And this is one of the things about cars. People want a car from their country. Now, there's a lot of people who are trying to account for what happened to Detroit. Why is the United States not the massive producer it was? Why don't we dominate global automobile production? And I would suggest for you that this is an engineering question. It's a marketing question. It's an international finance question. But people, by and large, in many ways, have been pointing the finger in the wrong direction. The real story here is the globe has recovered since World War II. You now have industrial capacity in Japan that they didn't, in India, in Mexico, in Thailand. People want to have a car from their country. It's an item of national pride. Just like I promise you, there's a lot of people who are with me right today who really want to have an American car. And so there people in China want to have a Chinese car. People in France want to have a French car. But in some ways, it's kind of a doomed process now because you really can't have a national car. This is a component network for the Ford Escort, Europe 1987. And as you can see on the upper left, you have from Austria of tires and radiators and heater hoses. United Kingdom, you have carburetors, rocker arms, clutch ignition, etc. Belgium, Canada, Norway. You can see this is global. This is a Ford. And from the United States, you have to look way down there, all the way down in the bottom. It says United States, EGR valves, wheel nuts, hydraulic tappet, and glass. And so clearly Ford's an American car, right? But apparently not. And this was a European manufactured project, so it makes sense. But let's look at the United States now. Unfortunately, my list is a little bit off because of the screen, but let me just see if I can do something to shift that a little bit. I have the technology for this. I do not. I can just, I'll read the stuff that's on the far right. But what you see here is there are only 15 cars in the United States that are made with a majority of American parts. So this is 2009. This is last year's production. Jeep is the number one. Number 2, 3, and 4 is having the highest percentage of American parts are Honda and assembled in the United States. Number 5 is Chevy. Then comes Acura, Honda again. And then comes a Chevy. Then comes a GMC. Then you have Acura, then Chevy, then it's back Toyota, Ford, Honda, Toyota. So there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's only 7 out of the top 15 cars that are American parts. Only 7 of them have American names on them. And so it turns out if you want to buy American, I don't know, what does this make sense? You buy Honda to buy American? But that's not just true of the United States. This is true of cars in France. This is true of cars in Spain. They are assembled with a globalized part network. And so the fundamental nature of the car has been transformed within our lifetimes. But the seed of this transformation, and this is interesting enough because the seeds of Ford's demise are sown in its ascendance. Ford is the pioneer for the true global megacorporation, and GM follows in the footsteps. And they dominated the planetary economy of the corporate world for decades, but now others have learned and they've found ways to do similar things. I want to do one more thing that I didn't do last time. Later, you should look this up, Jalopnik's table of who knows who. It's about what companies own and the ownership of brands, to what degree is a car an American car. I just want to recommend 3 books this time. You might want to grab a pencil real quick. The first one is by John Heitman. This is a wonderful look at the complexity of how the automobile contributes to American life. The second one is by James Flink, The Automobile Age. It really looks at the industry and how it developed. And then the last one, I know some of you would rather just grab the internet and Google something. So go take a look at David Hayward's Automotive History, Great History of General Motors and the Internationalization. So on that thought, I'm so excited to have Bob Casey. I'm trying not to fidget so much and make noise. I think it was real noisy last time, but I don't know what I've been doing. I've been following Bob Casey's work for many years, and Ford is the first story in the automobile and the most important story. So much of the innovation, so much of the way that the automobile became a common part of our lives, so much of the ways about how it transformed everything we do is determined by, and I want to make sure I distinguish between Henry Ford and the Ford Motor Company. That's 2 different things. And so, Bob, I know that you hadn't seen the PowerPoint, you hadn't seen this presentation before I launched onto it, but I'm hoping that you have some qualifications or some insights or some things that you'd like to offer about what we've seen today.
I was, you're right, I hadn't seen it, but I was fascinated by it. It was really terrific. I was struck especially by that list of these 100 largest economies, it turns out, as you say, 70% of them are corporations. Having spent the first part of my career in the steel industry, I was struck by the fact that there's not a single steel company in that list.
Yeah.
And how far down the list some of the automobile companies are. And it just speaks to the dynamism, really, of a world economy that the largest corporation, at least in terms of revenue, is Walmart, which doesn't make anything. It just sells stuff. And so it really speaks to changes, again, as you mentioned, in my lifetime, of how rapidly these sorts of things can change.
Can I jump in real quick with something about that?
Mm-hmm.
I was mentioning, if you talked about this 20 years ago, how different it was. There were 30 corporations. 10 of those corporations in the 30 were automobile manufacturers. So the automobiles were far more central to the global economy just 20 years, dramatically more central. And this year's data, if you go to that global ranking, the one that was, I think, number 14 was the SIAPEC, which is the Chinese National Energy Corporation. It's now moved to number 5. So 5th largest entity on the planet, unprecedented in human history.
Although part of the reason that individual automobile companies have moved down the list is, as you point out in another of your graphic, there's so many more automobile companies now.
Yeah.
And so there's each individual company is going to have a smaller piece of the pie. Yeah. I was struck by your discussion of Henry Ford and Durant, and when you go through the history of both companies as you did, one of the things you think of is that these two guys were really very different, and they ended up producing these very different companies.
Absolutely.
As I thought about them, though, I think they're more similar than we believe, than they appear to be at first. I mean, the first thing where they're similar is they're both, from to the soles of their feet, they are entrepreneurs. They want to start up a business and run it themselves. They're not comfortable working for other people. You read about Henry Ford, he wasn't that good an employee for other people because he always had his own idea. He always, whenever he was working for somebody else, he always had one foot out the door, planning on his own company. So that's something that they both had in common. Another thing is they both believed early on in the automobile as a mass consumption product. They never saw it as a luxury good that you're only going to sell a few of. They both wanted to sell a lot of them. Now, they went about it in very different ways, but they had that in common. They saw that this thing could be sold in vast numbers. They were both very, very intuitive in the way they ran their companies, which at points in their development really worked in their favor. And then later on, it really worked against both of them. But they went with their gut, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Another thing is they both saw value in vertical integration, in controlling that supply chain. Now, again, they went after it in different ways. Henry Ford was such a control freak. He wanted to own not just the individual companies. There was going to be one company. It was his company. And he wanted to be able to control every aspect, where Durant was more willing to buy a company but make sure they could supply him. And another similarity they shared, which turns out to be weakness, was they both proved in the long run not actually to be very good managers.
Oh.
And it cost Durant the control of General Motors. It didn't cost Henry Ford that, because he never sold any stock, or he kept the stock so closely held that it was only his family that he had to deal with. But in fact, as a lot of people, some people don't realize, by the late 30s, Ford wasn't the second ranking company anymore in the US. Chrysler was. Ford had slipped to third. And Durant lost control of the company to Sloan, who was a vastly superior manager. So I was just struck by the fact that it's easy to look at these guys and because their companies ended up so different, it's easy to look at them and say, well, these are two very different guys. Surprisingly, they had a lot of similarities.
Yeah. One of the things you pointed out about their vision of the automobile, which was so dramatically different from other manufacturers, especially the European manufacturers and export, because the European manufacturers were luxury goods, high price, handcrafted, phenomenally expensive. And so that design philosophy would make both of their cars a real success for the planetary market. Good. Excellent. Well, that's really wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. Amanda, do we have any questions from our, Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Ken. Hi, Bob.
Oh,
We have a few questions here. I'll start with what I think is an easy one. Ken, the books that you recommended, are those required reading in your history classes?
Actually, I've used Flink for about 20 years, and I've used John Heitman's book in the more recent years because they are so wonderful. I mean, the scope and creativity of John Heitman's approach is wonderful, and Flink is so detailed and technical. The downside of the Flink text is it concludes about 1970-ish, I think. I don't recall exactly the year, but yeah. Flink has a lot more numbers. Some people like more numbers in that, and some people don't. So, but there's so much written, and there's so many wonderful books to recommend. So, be careful. I'm not saying those are the best. I'm just saying those are two that I enjoy. So
I bet there are a few fabulous books behind Bob there in those shelves.
yeah, Bob tells me he's read a lot of those too. So
some of them.
So I had a question early on. Corporation
just a second.
revenue.
I'm sorry. I'm going to cut you off. Bob, would you add a book or two that you really think helps you sort out the automobile, or a favorite?
Well, a book, my favorite book on Henry Ford that I think helps sort him out a lot is called The People's Tycoon. And now I'm under pressure and I'm blanking on, he's a historian at the University of Missouri.
We have someone off screen who can Google that and get it for us.
And I'm blanking on his name, but it's a really excellent, if you want one volume on Henry Ford, one-stop shopping, that's really an excellent.
Good. Okay, I'm sorry, Amanda. Could you go ahead?
That's all right. That was a good question. So this question came early on. Corporation revenues are made up from revenue from the countries they operate in. Does that make them the real international leaders in trade and diplomacy?
Corporate revenues come from multiple countries in multiple different ways. And the verdict is out on that answer. Many people argue that the dominant feature of the world we live in is the nation state. And if the United States decides it's going to clamp down on GM, then it's going to clamp down on GM. But other people would say that, well, they can't clamp down on GM because if GM fails, they're going to have to bail them out, that the states are hostage. Furthermore, that if you try to tax a company, the way the global distribution market works, for example, if I have an alternator made in Mexico, Mexico wants to slap a tax on it, I can change the price I charge myself for that part in Mexico, reduce the cost that I sell it to myself for, and keep the tax payment to the government of Mexico the same. It also keeps the governments hostage for labor reasons, employment, local taxes. And so there is no corporation every corporation who goes into a community begins negotiating their role in the community, how many taxes are going to pay, how much utilities is going to cost before. And so communities do not have the upper hand, nor do corporations. It's a political compromise on both sides.
Okay, we have another question here. In your opinions, who is a modern day comparison to Ford and Durant?
I don't know that. I'll go first. First of all, I remembered the name of the author. It's Stephen Watts.
Very good.
I don't know that there is a modern day equivalent because the industry has so changed, and the kind of executive that was needed then is very different from what's needed now. Somebody like Soichiro Honda would be who started from scratch as they did, as Ford and Durant did. He might be a modern day equivalent, or of course he's long gone now, but a relatively modern day equivalent. I'm not sure. I mean, someone who dominated the industry for a while, and then is dominating the news in different ways. Carlos Ghosn, who tried to do on a global scale the kind of thing that Ford and Durant were doing. But I think the industry has changed so much that it's hard to find direct analogies.
Yeah. I wonder if Elon Musk is positioned in some ways to move in that direction. It's way too early to arrive at some kind of comparison about their impact, but there are some similarities in types of things you mentioned about drive, entrepreneurship. I don't know what his management skills are like, so or you might reach out of the automobile industry, and the other defining technology of our age is information processing. And actually, Bob, you're probably better positioned to do this than I am. If I were to try and draw an analogy between Steve Jobs or Bill Gates and Henry Ford and Billy Durant or Henry Ford, do you have any guess how we might go about doing that analogy?
Well, I think I think you're right. It seems to me that the two great 20th century technologies were automobiles and information technology, so people like Gates and Jobs were those kinds of seminal entrepreneurs. And it seems to me Jobs is a little more like Henry Ford in that Jobs was also a hardware guy, where Gates really wasn't.
Okay.
Although if you sort of read about Jobs and Wozniak was much more of a hardware guy than Jobs was, but Jobs knew his stuff with the hardware and the software, but he also knew his stuff with the market, and he had a particular vision of the market. Interestingly, the Apple products were always at the upper end of the market rather than down at the lower end, especially once he got into the Macs and things. They were at the higher end. So it was a different kind of vision from Henry Ford. Someone like Gates was, I don't think, and somebody who knows more about him could prove me wrong, I don't think he was really so much a hardware guy as he was a software guy. I mean, that was his genius. Yeah. And then he was also a really tremendous businessman, and he saw his opportunities with IBM. And as knowledgeable computer people will tell you, Microsoft software is not that great, or at least wasn't that great.
I'm learning it now.
But neither was neither was VHS that great.
Yeah.
But VHS came to dominate, and Microsoft came to dominate because Jobs made the right, Gates made the right business decisions at the time. Jobs is a little bit like Billy Durant in that he built a company, lost it, and then got it back.
Right. You know, I think I see a good article in your future, by the way, Bob. So
we have several people who've commented that Jeff Bezos might be another one to throw into that.
Yes, that's
yeah,
A
absolutely.
lot to explore there.
Yeah.
We have Larry, who is a retired auto dealer, and he's wondering if either of you have some comments to make about Ford and GM and the development of dealers.
I think, let me just give a real quick, in explaining what happened in the 1950s to the American automobiles, there's a lot of reasons to think that the relations with dealers in Detroit were a massive problem. The dealers continuous being forced to take cars that they didn't want in the 60s, that there was overinflated shipping and handling. The dealers were responsible for paying huge fees for marketing rather than lose investment money on inventory, excess inventory sitting in shops or sitting in warehouses in Detroit. They shipped them all out to the dealerships to be on their shelves. And so there was a lot of consumer complaints about dealership conduct, and some of those origins actually have to do with the Detroit as it's being challenged, trying to find ways to claw and trying to extract its wealth from the dealers that it couldn't get from the marketplace. And so that's one of the more sad and more interesting elements of the dealer-Detroit relationship. Now, as far as the early history, I think there's probably a lot of similarities between GM and Ford about how they decided to set up centralized assembly plants and things like that. That's just my observations. Bob, do you have?
Yeah, Ford, fairly early, Ford started doing regional assembly plants based very much on freight rates. And so where the rates changed and got higher to ship beyond that point, that's where they'd put an assembly plant. So that they were shipping parts from Detroit and then shipping cars on from that, assembled cars from that plant. Ford developed a dealer network in a really good network very early. James Couzens, one of the early partners, and really the business genius in the early days of Ford Motor Company. Couzens developed this dealer network, and then that was picked up by a guy named Norval Hawkins, who's a name that's vanished from most people's memory, but a fascinating character. And Hawkins really developed the Ford dealer network and specified layouts and the kinds of equipment you're supposed to have and the way the dealers are supposed to behave and how you make the dealership welcoming to the public, and things like if you have to tow a car in, tow it at night so that people don't see a broken Ford being towed. Don't put up glass so that people can't see Fords being repaired. But he was also really hard-nosed with dealers about sales quotas and pushing them. And he sent people out to talk to the dealers and say, why aren't you selling? This guy over here is selling more cars than you are. What's wrong with you? And then in light of your comments, in 1920, when Ford got himself in trouble, he bought out all of his remaining stockholders and he got into a cash flow problem. He did exactly what you were talking about. He pushed cars out to the dealers and made them buy the cars. And that's how he helped the company's cash flow by putting a crimp in the dealer's cash flow. And then they might have to go out and borrow money. Ford didn't like to borrow money. He wasn't going to borrow money. But his poor dealers, in many cases, didn't have any choice.
So gentlemen, we have reached the 1 o'clock mark. Well, at least the 1 o'clock mark here in Kansas. So we traditionally say goodbye and then we stay on for overtime for people who can stick around. And we sure hope that most people can do that because we have a lot of questions to still get to, a lot of really good questions. So I just want to let everyone know that if you ever thought that it would be cool to study cars and get a bachelor's degree at the same time, you need to share that with people that you know. This is the greatest community of car people here in McPherson, Kansas that you've ever met. You'll not see a larger group of young people who are excited about old cars, and they can come here and get their education and spend their time learning about all of these great things, as well as how to restore a car and why to restore a car or why not to restore a car. So we encourage you to share about McPherson College with anyone you know who might be interested in that. If you haven't registered for next week's topic, on July 16th, we're doing The Road to Perdition, How the Automobile Liberated Women and Captivated Teenagers. And so we have two wonderful guests. One is 16-year-old Abby Paulson. Her father and mother are both graduates of McPherson College, and her father teaches in our auto restoration program. And so Abby has restored a Model T and got it running, and it's a beauty. And so Abby will be representing not only the female side of the car world, but also the teenager side. And she's got great stories to share with us. She's been raised in old cars and she knows them inside out. Along with Abby will be a McPherson College graduate, Tabitha Hammer. Tabitha worked for Hagerty in a number of their programs, and most recently, as they purchased the Greenwich Concours, Tabitha was appointed as the director of that event. And so we're really excited to welcome Tabitha back. I met her in 2009 when I came back to the college, and she was running our car show. And now she's running one of the great Concours events in our country. So I'm really excited to welcome them. You can go to mcpherson.edu/wheels of change to sign up for that. In the meantime, stick around if you can. To those of you who have to leave, we wish you happy motoring. All right. Gentlemen, shall we dig into some of these questions?
Yeah.
I should say you can dig into some of these questions.
No, actually, Amanda, I meant to ask your opinion on a couple of those, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, thanks. I prefer to field the questions rather than answer them, to ask the questions rather than answer them. All right. How did these companies capitalize so quickly into such large sums of money? What would make an investor let their hard-earned money go to GM or Ford? How did Ford do it, since he wasn't fond of Wall Street or of banks?
In the case, well, one thing that you need to understand is early on in the automobile industry, it didn't actually take a lot of capital to go into production because most of the early producers were assemblers. What they needed to do was line up a bunch of suppliers who could, foundries, machine shops, and wheel makers and body makers and that sort of thing. And so what you needed was a building and people. And so the startup capital was not that big. Now, where a lot of them got into trouble is between the startup and buying all the parts and selling the cars, they might run out of operating capital. And if you look at Ford's bank account, they came really close to running out of operating capital. But with Ford, once they got the business running, got over that early hump, Henry was very stingy about paying dividends. He wanted to put money back into the company. And they generated their own capital. and just became this huge money machine, enough so that some of their stockholders actually were annoyed by it, which is one reason Henry eventually bought them out, because they wanted dividends and he wanted to plow money back into the company. I know less about GM, but I think part of Durant's genius was getting people to buy stock that maybe wasn't worth that much, and he managed to do a lot of assembling without a whole lot of cash, because he kept trading stock, and you're essentially you're buying on the hope that stock is actually going to turn out to be worth.
Yeah.
He says it will be worth.
I'd add one more dynamic to that, and that's that the absolute craze of demand at the time. Every investor had to see that people were screaming for cars. There'd been a series of things like the Glidden trials, which had very large turnouts in the early days because no cars would finish, or one or two cars. And by 1910 or 1912, all the cars were finished and they stopped running because it was pointless. Everybody could endure the drive. And so the car had entered a new era in this time period, and so people were screaming to get their hands into that pot and get some money out of it. Oh, actually, one more follow-up to illustrate how dramatically different this is capital-wise, as Bob's comment. Since the Second World War, we don't have any new mass producers start up that didn't have massive government backing. If you look at the Korean manufacturers or Japanese or India or China, they're all government companies. The only exception to that is Elon Musk. It's yet to see if he's going to be a mass manufacturer, and a huge amount of his revenue stream actually comes from government contracts, was where he made his money. And so it's not clear that an entrepreneur could start a car company in the modern era.
Yeah, once the assembly line methods became widely adopted, then the capital costs of building even a single plant were so huge that either you were going to have to borrow a lot of money, or you better already have some money to be able to establish a company.
Yeah. And Kaiser didn't have enough, Tucker didn't have enough, and everybody who tried it afterwards said I needed 5 or 10 times more than I had.
All right, another question. Please discuss the impact of William Knudsen on both Ford and GM.
William Knudsen was he worked for the Keim company, which made stampings. And Ford Motor Company was buying stampings from them and decided that they just buy the company and move all their equipment to Highland Park. And Knudsen came along with the Keim works. And it was soon apparent that he had a genius for production. Ford put him in charge of building a lot of these branch plants that they were establishing around the country. He was a very strong-willed guy, a big, strong-willed Swede. And Ford already had one of those, actually, a guy named Charles Sorensen. And Knudsen and Sorensen clashed. And Knudsen decided that there were greener fields in other places, and he moved on to General Motors, taking a lot of his knowledge about mass production and building plants with him, and he became the production driver at Chevrolet, and he is part of the reason that Chevrolet began to overtake Ford and overtake the Model T.
And I'd add that Knudsen also, many people argue, a significant impact on World War II.
Yes.
in the run up to the Second World War in the late 1930s, Roosevelt created a war production agency. This is about 2 years prior to Pearl Harbor. And Knudsen was appointed as the head of this to oversee war production for the United States. GM took on all the toughest contracts, had the lion's share of military production of minesweepers and tanks and aircraft components. And so Knudsen played a very significant role in that because of his production acumen.
So another question is, why didn't or couldn't the Dodge brothers keep pace with Ford and GM?
The Dodge brothers, and of course, you have to remember the Dodge brothers got their start making parts. They owned a machine shop, and they were making engines and parts for Oldsmobile. And they really got established in the automobile industry making parts for Ford Motor Company. Eventually they made enough profit from that they wanted to go off and build cars of their own. Henry Ford didn't like the idea of being dependent on the Dodge brothers. So it was actually a fairly amicable split. The Dodge brothers wanted to make their own car. Henry wanted to get out from under the Dodge brothers, and the brothers, by that time, they had a factory in Hamtramck, known as Dodge, Maine. And they decided, though, to build a different car from Ford. In fact, there's a quote that may be apocryphal, but it would sound like John Dodge. Supposedly, he said someday Henry Ford's customers are going to want to buy a real car. That's what we're going to build. And so the Dodge was a notch up in power and luxury, and not that it was a luxurious car, but it was a notch up from the Model T. It was a notch up in price. And there was, by that time, the Dodges, this 1914, 1915, by that time, the market was beginning to segment enough that there was room just above the Model T to be a very successful automaker. And so the Dodges never really set out to dominate the industry. They were quite happy to find a profitable niche and just fill that niche.
It's interesting. I knew that I had thought there was a lot more friction between Ford and the Dodge brothers. I mean, because one of the things that was, Ford wasn't giving the dividends. All the dividends were going reinvested back into the line. And the Dodge brothers actually wanted the dividends from their work, and they wanted to live a more complete life than Ford was living, integrated. And so having their own car factory, car process where they could capsulize it and be manageable and personal, I think was more their style. But I thought there was a lot more friction. But that's interesting that they
actually sued him to make him give up more of the dividend, to increase the dividends, which is one of the reasons he ultimately ended up buying everybody out, because he didn't want that. But they seem to have maintained fairly good personal relations. And as I say, Ford was wanting to pull out and make more of those parts that Dodge was making. And Dodge was wanting to make, the brothers were wanting to make more of the parts and put them into their own car. So their interests actually were converging by the fact that their business interests were diverging.
I can't hear you. Did I do something?
No, it was me.
Okay.
Bob, what do you think about the Ford Model T 100 project, and would you share a little bit, give some context to that for our audience?
I'm assuming they're talking about when Ford set out to build a series of Model Ts to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Model T in 2008. They set out to build accurate Model Ts, which from scratch, which turned out to be enormously expensive because, of course, nobody had the tooling to do all of this. I'm not sure that they ended up making their own engine blocks. They might have, because that was just going to be to make, and they only made a few of them. It was going to be enormously expensive to do things like cast the engine blocks, but they created from scratch all the parts, trying to go back to the original drawings and building them to the original specs. It was an enormous undertaking. And eventually those cars, most of those cars, interestingly enough, ended up at Greenfield Village, where they are being used as every day. They're being used. You can get a ride in a Model T, and they put 8,000 to 10,000 miles a year on those cars, which means that those Model Ts from 2008 have a whole lot of new parts in them, because at that rate, and especially trundling around Greenfield Village at no more than 15 miles an hour, probably, that's really hard on the cars. And so those cars have undergone a lot of rebuilding over the years. And so those cars aren't nearly as original as they were, but it was a remarkable undertaking, and it just showed how difficult it is to take something where the tooling is all gone and recreate it.
Well, gentlemen, there's never enough time for us to get through all the questions, but I so appreciate the time and the thought you've given to these today. And to all of the people who've submitted questions, thank you for your comments, and I'll be sharing the rest of those with Bob and Ken. I want to remind you of our next webinar next Thursday, The Road to Perdition. I hope you'll join us for that. Ken or Bob, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I only say that I've really enjoyed this, and I'm honored to be part of it. You folks have a great program. Ken and I have met before. It's really fun and an honor to be on the program with him.
We'll have you back.
And I feel the same thing, but even more. So for years, I've been watching your work, and for me, it's a particular honor and joy to work with you, Bob. So thank you.
Great. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week for Wheels of Change.